Hey everybody, Tom Salemi here. Welcome back to the Device Talks weekly podcast. We've got a great interview with Helen Reeve-Stoffer and Andy Weiss of ReCor. Talked with them about a month ago about their progress with their renal denervation project and the various clinical trials they have going on. So great story there. Chris and I will talk about our end of the year coverage, what we'll be doing in terms of picking our news of the year. We hope you'll be part of that. Stay tuned and listen, and you can find out how you can be on next week's Device Talks weekly podcast. I hope you caught our Striker Talks podcast that came out yesterday featuring Andy Pierce, the president of MedSurg and Neurotech. We are done with our Striker Talks podcast for 2022. We're done with our Medtronic Talks podcast for 2022. We are done with our Intuitive Talks podcasts for 2022. And we have one more Device Talks weekly podcast coming out next week, and we'll have more details on that coming right up. All right, you ready for this?
Ready.
Chris Newmarker, how are you, sir?
Tom, good to be here. Good to be here.
Chris Newmarker, you look tired. You tired today?
Tired?
Yeah.
A tad. I don't know what it could be. I mean, maybe it was the 3 foot high wall of snow that the plow left at the end of my driveway.
Chris Newmarker, you deserve a break. I think we'll take off this week from the Newmarkers Newsmakers,
I'm tired.
and I think we should get you some help for developing the stories of the year that we'll have on next week's podcast.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So we'll bring in our expert editorial team next week.
Exactly. Yeah.
Review the most read articles on our news sites. We'll compile that list, right? We can do that.
As you near the end of the year, I mean, it's a time of a lot of things like, holiday gatherings with friends, presents perhaps under the tree, doing, sledding or, some kind of fun holiday market. And of course, for, people in, the media business like us, it's the end of year retrospective.
Get you right here. Get you all weepy. But I think we should invite our listeners as well to contribute their stories of the year. So we can do that in a couple of ways. Now, you've already reached out on social media, right? You're asking folks to share their stories of the year.
I have begun ringing the "Bring me your ideas" bell. Yes.
And I think in addition to that, we're posting a link on Mass Device, an article on Mass Device with a link that will allow our listeners to record 1-minute recording of what they think the big stories of the year would be. They can just make sure that you have a good microphone, make sure you've got your thoughts together, and just record a minute or less, just what you think the big important stories of 2022 are. And or if you want to talk about what you think the big stories of 2023 will be, record that, and we'll try to include them in next week's podcast, along again with the expert insights from our entire editorial team. How's that sound?
That sounds, I was thinking actually that I was going to get a sandwich board and a bell and a kettle and go up to Medtronic headquarters in Fridley, Minnesota and ring it. And, instead of them giving, money, because, they could put ideas in the kettle. But I like your idea better. I think your idea is better. I don't have to, the folks at Medtronic are, really nice, good people. But,
you won't have to get tackled by security. I get it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I want to.
I'm envisioning you running away in the sandwich board. No need to do that. Plus, there's snow on the ground. You don't want to be outside.
That's true. I have to trudge over snow. There could be ice. Yeah, we don't want to. Your idea is great. I like it. We'll do this.
So we'll do that.
Much better.
So we're inviting our listeners to contribute their stories of the year. Look on Mass Device. We'll post it on our social media channels, and I'll have a link on this podcast, on the podcast page, or the page for this podcast. And you can record your own message. Again, keep it to a minute. Say your name and the company you're with, or whatever affiliation you want to use. Let us know what you think the big story of 2022 was and why. Let us know what stories you'd be looking forward to watching develop in 2023.
2023.
Separately, you can do one or the other. Try not to do both. Unless you can do it both under a minute, then do that. But try to keep your messages short, and we'll include them in next week's podcast. It would be great to hear from you directly. And of course, if you don't want to speak these truths, then by all means, comment on social media. Send Chris and I a message, right? Direct message on LinkedIn always works. Yep.
Always happy to get a DM. Yeah.
So yes, we're going to be working out our stories of the year. We won't have an interview next week, I don't think. We'll just be focused on that. And that will give Chris the break that he needs from developing all of these new markers, newsmakers. It's a lot of work, right, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I'm working hard, man. I'm working overtime. I mean,
it's just working all the time. Wow, working overtime. No, there's a song.
Remember there was an old SNL skit like with like Will Ferrell's Bush, like going like I was working Sundays, working overtime, working Sundays.
Thinking of Taking Care of Business, the song Taking Care of Business, but we don't need to go down that route. Anyway, all right. Well, that sounds like a plan, Chris Newmarker.
We're avoiding all kinds of tangents here, but yes, let's get some ideas. I mean, there were things off the top of my head that I already think, would just be slam dunks, on this list. I mean, something like, unfortunately, Philips has, been going through this just awful recall and, just more developments with that. I mean, that is going to be on the list. On the flip side, we've got like these really like interesting, exciting spaces right now, like surgical robotics, brain computer interfaces. I mean, I see that going on there as well. But, I mean, I'm somebody who's writing about the industry all the time, but I would love to hear from, people inside the industry, who, are like in the thick of this. I mean, what's been getting you excited? What do you, think was, really, really significant for the industry in the past year, and that could be something that could, continue to make waves into the new year.
Yep. No, that's a great point. And I think company specific, I'm sure we'll be talking about J&J's acquisition of Abiomed. I know J&J folks are excited about moving back into the heart space after divesting themselves of Cordis many years ago, or a few years ago. I don't know if it qualifies as many, but a while ago.
It's pandemic time, Tom.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So we could talk about individual companies. I'm sure we'll have a great list. And I've got some other sort of broader things that are happening that are sort of span over multiple companies that we'll be talking about, that I think are some pleasant and unpleasant changes to medical devices. So, all right. Well, so folks, let your voice be heard. Reach out to us on social media. Use the device that we'll be putting up in Mass Device that allows you to record your own message. So many ways for our listeners to get involved, Chris Newmarker, and to give you, again, a well-deserved break. So
fantastic.
Well, Helen Reeve-Stoffer and Andy Weiss, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to be here.
Great to have you and great to learn about ReCor. Andy, we had you on the podcast last year, and I'm going to connect folks to that. We'll have the link in the show notes so they can go back and listen to your path into the medical devices. And it was a great story, your experiences at Coaxia and such, and I advise people to give it a listen because it's great context. But today we're going to focus on Paradise and on ReCor and on your clinical trials and on Helen. And Helen, I'd love to start off this podcast just understanding a bit about your path into the medical device industry. What drew you to this space?
Sure. So I actually started off in academic research. So I have a PhD in cellular pharmacology that I got in the UK. I came over to the US to be a postdoc at the VA Medical Center in Minneapolis and spent about 7 years working in the cardiopulmonary research arena there under the chief of cardiology. I actually transitioned to industry in 2001. I moved over to the dark side and started to work with Guidant in their clinical affairs team under their program management group. And so I've actually been in industry now for more than 20 years. I've worked in big companies, so Guidant was the first, then Boston Scientific. I've worked in smaller companies. I worked with a company called Cameron Health. Mm-hmm. So they were a startup company that brought the subcutaneous ICD to the market. They were purchased by Boston Scientific, so I went back there for a while. And then I actually joined ReCor way back in 2013. So Andy and myself joined not very dissimilar times.
Wow.
So I've been here for the whole program, and I was in place well before we started the Radiant studies.
Andy and I talked about this in our conversation that again we'll replay, but 2013 was a different time from 2014 for renal denervation. How did you feel about things on I think it was January 9th, 2014?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, we were, as a company, in the process of running a registry at the Achieve registry, waiting for the Medtronic data to come out. And I was at a conference with Mano Aya, our founder at the time, when we heard the news. And obviously it was surprising. At the time, perhaps a blow, but I think in reality, what's come since then has put the field in a much better position anyway. So I think it was a point at which everybody had to kind of make that stop and think. It led to some very interactive and positive work with the FDA, especially for us, I would say. And I think we're in a much better space now.
And for folks who aren't familiar, that was when Medtronic released, was it Simplicity 1 or 2 trial results?
Oh, it's 3. It's Simplicity HCM 3. Yeah.
HCM 3 results that were disappointing and sort of set the renal denervation space back for a lot of people, but not for ReCor. Before we get into, I do want to talk about Paradise and ReCor, and Andy, I'll get to you in a moment. But Helen, as a follower of the industry, when we started talking about renal denervation in clinical trials, I have a hard time sort of, especially on some more higher profile conversations, there seems to be a lot more gray area than perhaps I'm accustomed to. And admittedly, I'm not trained in this. And I find clinical trial data to be a bit challenging for me to sort of process. So I rely upon experts. But from your perspective, is this a more difficult space, hypertension a more difficult space than any other space, or than other spaces in medical devices, or is it as difficult as others, or maybe less difficult?
I actually think that hypertension is a pretty difficult space for any company, whether it be pharma or whether it be medical devices. If you think about kind of how blood pressure is, and blood pressure is our outcome, it changes throughout the day just naturally. And then you take into consideration the fact that, whatever you do during the day, whether you're stressed, whether you're active, whether you're inactive, that can also influence blood pressure. And then, of course, we take into consideration that, that blood pressure changes depending on whether patients are taking drugs or not. It makes it a pretty difficult space to be able to get a positive outcome in. And, as we went through our clinical trial program, we had to look at each one of those different things and work out a solution as to how we could overcome some of the challenges that you see with just measuring blood pressure.
Great. And I'm anxious to get into those. But Andy, if you wouldn't mind just bringing our listeners up to speed on ReCor and Paradise, what is your approach to lessening or diminishing hypertension?
Well, what ReCor has been doing for the past, something like 15 years is developing and evaluating a technology which would denervate or, kill the renal nerves, the nerves that run outside the renal artery, with a catheter located inside the renal artery. And our specific approach was to do that combining ultrasound sound waves to heat the tissue and water circulating in a balloon to simultaneously cool the tissue. So we've been designing an ultrasound system, which has a tiny little, what we call ultrasound transducer to emit the ultrasound waves. They're emitted in a 360-degree pattern when the transducer is located in the artery. So they heat the nerves all the way around the artery in a length of about 5 millimeters. We can control the depth of the ultrasound energy and the power by our catheters being powered by our generator, and we adjust the power and frequency and time for each patient's arterial diameter. So we know we're emitting the right amount of ultrasound to ablate the nerves at a certain depth from the walls of the renal artery. So we ablate to a certain depth where the renal nerves are. We do that in a very, very controlled way. And then the balloon circulates water and it keeps the renal artery itself cool. So we simultaneously cool the artery so there's no arterial injury, or our goal is no arterial injury. And we ablate in a 360-degree pattern in emissions that are about 5 millimeters long. And our technology we've developed over time, many years, increasing control, adjusting frequency, power, and time. We've used bench models, computer models, and many, many animal tests to ensure that we get the right nerve injury, but don't injure any tissue too far out, called non-target tissue. And then we've put this in trials, first pilot feasibility trials, and then with Helen's arrival, continuing to run those, but most importantly, running our IDE randomized sham-controlled trials. But we are unique in companies, as far as I know, in having a an ultrasound-based system with water cooling in a balloon. And now we've run many, many tests. And I think our total number of patients that have been enrolled in studies is somewhere between 500 and 700. So we've got substantial human clinical evidence, trying to build enough evidence to go to the FDA and ask their view on our safety and efficacy.
Great. And ReCor is operating as a division of Otsuka, which is a Japanese pharma and consumer company as well. They have two other divisions.
ReCor was founded in 2009 by Sofinova partners, Antoine Peppernick, and my friend and colleague Mano Iyer, through the acquisition of a company called ProRhythm, where we acquired the ProRhythm technology portfolio. And then we took their technology and adapted it to be used in the renal arteries for renal denervation. So we built on this great technology that we purchased and completely changed it and adapted it for what we do for the renal nerves. We were running our trials. When the Medtronic HTN-3 data came out, it really stopped the field. This is that January 9th, 2014 date. Many companies left the field. We felt very strongly that our technology could prove to be successful. We believed strongly in the basic concept of renal denervation to lower blood pressure. What we simply needed to do is have the funds to go demonstrate it with well-designed clinical trials. So we were very pleased to find Otsuka that was interested in making a series of investments, first small and then escalating, and to find Helen so that we could take them funds and the clinical trial knowledge and then put those together to demonstrate whether or not this technology worked. In 2018, after our first trial read out positively, that's the solo trial, Otsuka decided to acquire us. So we've been acquired since mid of 2018, during which time Otsuka's continued to invest heavily in the company in both technology development, clinical trials, and we're also exploring our technology in new therapeutic uses at the pilot stage.
Oh, interesting. Before we get into your clinical trials, as I mentioned, there were a lot of potential. There was a lot of interest in renal denervation in 2013. A lot less after January 9th, 2014. You and Medtronic are the primary leaders in the space. Are there others developing renal denervation systems, or are you the only two?
We're aware that there are other companies that have been working in renal denervation and continue to. Okay. I don't know all of them.
Okay.
Yeah. So I only know a few of them, and it's an international world, so there may be some in different continents that I'm unaware of. Where we see them, if we see them at all, is in clinical trials. And there are very, very few that are in clinical trials, at least at the sites that we see.
Terrific. Okay. So Helen, let's talk about your clinical trials. You've had a lot of great news lately. I'm trying to think of the best way to sort of break this up so folks can understand it as to the number of trials you've had and the outcomes that you've had from each. So what was your most recent news? What was your trial that produced the most recent news?
So the most recent trial that read out was the Radiance-2 trial. That's our pivotal trial. So that read out just recently. We presented the data at TCT, and we met our primary endpoints very cleanly in that trial.
Can you walk us through the trials that you've have conducted over the
Sure,
recent years?
Maybe that would be easier for context. So the first trials that we started were the Radiance HTN Solo and the Radiance HTN Trio trials. So those were trials that we designed early on in collaboration with FDA just after the 2014 Medtronic readout from Simplicity HTN-3. So we're looking there at two different patient populations. The Solo trial was in the mild to moderate low risk hypertensive patients. And then the Trio trial was actually, and still is, the only trial in resistant hypertension. So truly resistant hypertensive patients. And both trials were designed almost exactly the same, other than the different patient populations. So we had two different phases. In the Solo trial, what we did was we took the patients very safely off their blood pressure medication for a short period of time. That took us to our primary endpoints, after which we then did a titrated blood pressure medication change over the next 4 months. And then in the Trio study, which, as I said, was the resistant patient population, we standardized all of the patients on a single pill triple combination hypertensive drug. So that was pretty unique, but it really demonstrated that the patients we were treating in that trial were really resistant hypertension patients. And the same, very similar design. So for the first 2 months, they remained stable on that pill. And then we titrated antihypertensive medications as needed. So the two trials were run in parallel with almost exactly the same design other than the different patient populations. And then the RADIANCE-2 trial was really our confirmatory study. So that was in a very similar patient population to the SOLO trial. So again, mild to moderate patients, low risk patients. And in terms of kind of size, the RADIANCE-2 trial was larger than both SOLO and TRIO. So it was adding additional data to our already large portfolio for us to get enough information to be able to provide information to the FDA.
And we'll talk about the results in a moment, but I just want to learn a little more about the trial. So who are the physicians that were the researchers in this study, who are the investigators in this study? Who will be ultimately performing the procedure? Is it just interventional radiologists, or is it a subset of that?
So if you look at kind of when we went back to start the trial, we really went to two different populations of physicians. When I started actually in the hypertensive space, it reminded me very much of the heart failure space when I was working in guidance, in that you have a device being used in a population that's normally managed by a non-device physician. So with us, of course, it's really important to not only have great hands to be able to do the procedure, but also we need to have the hypertensive specialists, those people that know how to deal with and manage the patients with high blood pressure. So we looked at working with both those populations. And actually, one of the very key things I think probably to our success is that when we started this program, we worked very closely with Michel Azizi, who is he's a hypertension specialist in Paris. And at that time, he was the only person to have run a positive controlled trial in renal denervation. So he really helped us to understand what we needed to do to be able to create a trial that could be successful. But in general, we work with interventional cardiologists. One of our co-PIs is Dr. Ajay Kirtane at Columbia, and he's been very important in the development of the trial portfolio as well. We have interventional radiologists, although to be fair, they are less frequent in our clinical trials than the interventional cardiologists. And then the hypertension specialists are very important. And when we were putting all the trial centers together, we tried to ensure that we had a good collaboration between whoever was doing the procedure, whether it be interventional cardiology or radiology, and a hypertension specialist at that site.
How were you able to get them to collaborate? Were they just looking at each other's data, or are they sort of, did you physically have meetings with them, or perhaps virtually have meetings with them these days? I mean, how closely were they collaborating?
There was very close collaboration. In fact, it was necessary that they were collaborating well. When we did the first sort of site selection for the RADIANCE-HDN trial, so that's for SOLO and TRIO, at that time, of course, we were able to do on-site visits. So I have a team that goes out to the sites and works with the different sites to identify who the people at the clinical site should be to be in the trial. And they sat down together in the same rooms and discussed, whether they could find the patients, how the procedure was going to be done. These are very complicated trials. Not only are they sham controlled, they had to be blinded. And that meant that not only the patients were blinded, but also the people following the patients. And so we had to ensure that we had very strong collaboration between the hypertension team and the interventional team.
And I believe I talked with Andy about this. Andy, I believe I talked with you about this when we spoke last, but how did COVID impact the trial? I imagine you did have to suspend things for a while.
We did have to stop the trial, yeah. So in March 2020, we temporarily halted enrollment in the trial. We restarted around about June timeframe.
Oh, okay.
So we weren't stopped for as long as maybe we thought we were going to be, although thinking about it at the time, I think, Andy, we had hoped that we'd be stopped for about 2 or 3 weeks. But one of the data analyses that we did when RADIANCE-2 came out at TCT was a pre-specified COVID analysis, and we saw no effect of COVID. So, working very, very closely with the sites during COVID and after COVID, we managed to not have any impact of COVID on our clinical trials.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about the results of your trial. As I said, I am not a trial expert, but I'm on your website and I see some arrows pointing down with some really impressive numbers. So let's talk about what you took out of Radiant 2, which you talked about a little bit at the start.
So one of the things I think that's really important with our 3 trials, Tom, is that we've had incredibly consistent results. We've seen the same blood pressure changes with the solo cohort, the trio cohort, and Radiant 2. So I think that goes to demonstrate the strength of the trials. And what we're showing is that even with an ambulatory blood pressure, and just for context, the numbers that you hear of with ambulatory tend to sound smaller, but are actually very meaningful. What we've shown is that we can reduce blood pressure in all these populations, whether it be mild to moderate hypertension or whether it be resistant hypertension, by just over 8 millimeters of mercury ambulatory.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we're also finding is that the sham group, which sometimes can be a little bit of a problem in terms of understanding kind of the difference between what happens with a therapy versus sort of a placebo, we're getting a very small drop there. So the difference we see between the treatment effect and the sham group is big and significant. And we showed that in all of our trials. And the data looks almost exactly the same between the trials, which is very, very important for blood pressure trials and really consistent.
Well, we talked about the difficulty of the hypertension space before, and others have had difficulty in this space, due largely, I think, to people taking their meds or not taking their meds, or just inconsistent medication. How did you solve for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually incredibly important. So the great thing about the SOLO and Radiant 2 trials is it gives us an opportunity to remove that adherence confounder. So the first phase of both of those trials is when we take patients off their medications. So again, we choose the population so that they're very low risk, so that there's no safety impact to the patients. We take them off their medication for no longer than 8 weeks. We allow the blood pressure to go up to a safe level, and then you see the effect of the Paradise system treatment. So that removes that confounder, which is great. The thing that we did in the trio trial to try and kind of overcome the issue with adherence was putting everybody on that single pill. I mean, there's a lot of data that suggests the more pills someone's taking every day, the less likely they are to take them. And so by just giving them a single pill, which contained 3 antihypertensive drugs, that really helped with our adherence challenges. And, just to sort of anecdotally, one of the other things that came out of TRIO, which I think was incredibly important as well, we consented, nearly 1,000 patients into that trial. And one of the things that we found is that, they're coming in on 3, 4, 5, 6 antihypertensive medications and still with high blood pressure. You put them onto that single pill and their blood pressure gets controlled. So we had a lot of patients that screened out of the study because they were on that single pill. So it really demonstrates that adherence is a challenge.
Wow. All right. Well, that is impressive. So are you done with the Radiance 2 trial, or are you still recruiting for that? I'm trying to remember if I saw that you were looking for patients.
No, that's completed. We've completed the recruitment in that. We're just doing the follow-up with the patients now.
Okay. So are you recruiting for any clinical trials at this point, or are you done with that part?
We've got a couple of trials. We've got one that's in the US. It's called Radiance CAP. They call it a continued access study. It allows us to continue treating patients in that interim period between when we finish the clinical trials and when we go to the FDA for approval. So that's actually active right now. And then we have a more real world evidence type of registry that's ongoing in Europe at the moment. And that's allowing us to collect much more open label type of data from patients.
That's terrific. So Andy, this must be an exciting time for you. What does this data allow you to do? What's next?
Well, first, a quick comment. Helen is she's not going to boast about herself, but I just need to say a moment that hypertension is very, very difficult to study because patients go on and off their medications all the time. There are many different causes of hypertension. And to actually have someone be consistent in their behavior, their diet, their lifestyle, and their medication levels over months, from the start of a treatment to an evaluation period, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months later, it's very, very hard. We adopted a very, very expensive and important approach, which was we hired people, we helped the sites manage patient by patient, and whether it was COVID or on meds or off meds or escalating meds, Helen's team was really very, very tight contact with the research coordinators, and we ran really tight studies. We feel that our studies evidence is very, very strong, hence the statistical significance in our study outcomes. It was a lot of work, but I do want to make sure people know that it's possible. It can be done. And we're evidence of that. And Helen, it made it happen. It's really an incredible kudos to her and her team. And this has been almost a decade-long effort. So we're very, very excited. And I want to make sure the listeners know Solo in mild to moderate patients, positive. Trio, resistant patients, positive. Radiance 2, positive. When you pull it all together, we have over 500 patients of data. The results are positive. And the other thing that we can do now is we've looked at, with 500 patients, do different subgroups respond or not respond? Do men respond more than women? Or older people versus younger people, obese people, non-obese, different types of blood pressure, diabetic patients, all of these different things that now we can do with this data. And as Ajay Kirtani presented a couple of weeks ago, all of these subgroups responded favorably to the denervation in that their blood pressure was reduced. And all the groups, there were no what are called intergroup interactions. Men and women both respond, older and younger, higher and lower blood pressures. So the data is very consistent in our trials, and it's positive. And I hope your listeners understand that our evidence shows that renal denervation can lower blood pressure. The FDA has to weigh in on the meaning of that. Our trials are the evidence that they will review, and our technology delivered that blood pressure reduction as demonstrated in the trials with their statistical significance. It's a lot of wonky stuff, but I want people to have confidence that the data in the trials is good and the data has meaning. It shows the blood pressure reductions. So with that, what can we do now, right? Now what we need to do is we need to go to the FDA primarily and have them evaluate the data and indicate to us and the market whether they think that means we have an effective device and whether it's safe and whether its balance of benefit and risk to patients warrants approval for treatment of patients in the United States. And we've been working with the FDA for many years. I believe we've met a lot of the goals they've set for us. And now they need to do that very, very intense scrutiny of our evidence. And we're very excited to go through that process with them. We don't know about panel or any of that stuff. That's all kind of, in the process that we're working through with them. We're very hopeful that by this time next year, we'll be able to have a judgment for them. And we're just very excited about that. So number one, we are anxious to have the FDA evaluate our Paradise URDN system for the treatment of hypertension for American, patients. Secondly, we're moving ahead in Europe because we've launched this registry called GPS, country by country in Europe. We're bringing the GPS registry to them so we can say, you've seen the studies we've done. Now let's put this in more routine use in the context of a registry so we can see how you might adopt this in your clinical practice in Europe because it's a new therapy. How do you refer patients? How do you work them up? Once they're treated, how they go back to their primary care physician? And what does that mean for their long-term outcomes? So now we're looking at routine use, therapeutic adoption in Europe, and establishing a basis for longer-term outcomes. And that includes both efficacy and safety. And that's the next step here. The other big effort that, as you can imagine, we're undergoing right now is to figure out how do we go from a pre-market research device into a device that's accepted as a therapy. The FDA is number one. Secondly, is to get the medical community to assess this therapy on its merits and issue guidelines and consensus statements to say, yes, they think it should be used or not. And if it should be used, in which patients? There are over 100 million Americans with hypertension. I doubt the societies are going to say, treat everyone. It doesn't make sense. I believe they'll start saying, let's treat the folks that are at the highest risk and the highest need, represented by those folks in the TRIO trial. And then I imagine they'll say slowly it can expand over time. So guidelines and consensus statements are key. Thirdly, we need to try to get reimbursement.
Right.
And so we're going down the path to, there's what's called a Category 3 code here in the United States. It's a research code. We need to move to a normal CMS code called a Category 1 code. So we're working with the association, SCI, ACC, AMA, CMS to try to put together a plan to get to a Category 1 code. And that code will allow routine reimbursement for this. So for the next few years, we're going to work on FDA approval. We'll work on guidelines and consensus statements. We'll work on getting reimbursement in the United States and Europe. And in some ways, the part that I'm most excited about is to see how the medical community responds to the evidence. It was just, the pooled evidence was just presented just a few weeks ago, and we've submitted journal articles. So hopefully that will get published. And then each country's hypertension society is going to have to discuss with this type of blood pressure reduction, which patients do they think this should be used for? And if so, how to then get them into a hospital where they can get treated. So, those are the next steps. And after this decade of work, we think we're ready to move that stage. Very, very exciting.
That is great. No, it's good. It's great to see a green light and not a yellow or a red.
Well, the studies have green
I guess we're
lights.
still yellow. Yes.
That's,
yeah.
It's our view.
As a company, you're able to move to the next square on the board. Yes.
Yeah. But the FDA review, consensus and guidelines, reimbursement and adoption, those are very, very exciting things. And we're just excited to be able to move in that direction.
And just to recap, you do have CE mark. So speaking to your point about plans in Europe and in Asia, we talked about this in the podcast. Otsuka has rights for sale in Asia. What will be required for you to be available in Asia?
Right. So Otsuka owns ReCor, so they have rights to all of ReCor.
Oh, that's a great point. When they invested in you, they got the rights to Asia.
Yeah.
Now they
bought it. So Otsuka has a strategy for clinical evaluation and development in Asia, and that's what they're working on. They ran a trial called ReQuire, which failed to meet its primary endpoints, much the same way as the Medtronic Spiral On trial just did. It was very similar in some of the challenge it faced. And they've restarted a new trial called Duo, which is, I would say, modeled after the Helen Reeve-Stoffer model. So it's patients that are going to be evaluated and then put on a single pill, in their case with 2 meds. And this trial has started, and it is another powered, sham-controlled, blinded trial of our technology. And in this case, on a single pill with 2 meds. That's why it's called Duo, as opposed to ours, which had 3 meds and was called Trio. And we're excited to have that run through. And we're hopeful and frankly, internally quite confident that if that trial's run to the Helen Reeve-Stoffer model, that they will have positive outcomes as well. That's something that they're working very intensely on right now.
And just to clarify, the single pill and the 3 meds is the pill incorporated to 3 meds? That throws me a bit.
So what happens is, and this has been studied, there are multiple classes of meds you can take for hypertension.
Yeah.
ACEs, ARBs, diuretics, CCBs, blah, 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 aldosterone antagonists. And doctors have known for years, one of the troubles is to get your patients to buy 3 different meds and then take each pill, some in the morning, some at night, et cetera, because it's complicated. And a couple of companies have made single pills with all 3 medications in them. So one of them is called X-Forge HCT. It's made by Novartis. And in a number of our countries, we specified that in our Trio study, that's the pill. Just take one, you get all 3 meds. And then the other one, Helen, I think was called Tribenzor. And we used in other countries, and that was made by another company. So these it's called polypharmacy. These single pills with multiple meds are common use. In some cases, they're on patent, in some cases off patent, but they exist.
Great. Final question for me. I know we have to go. Helen, you can start. We've been hearing a lot about renal denervation for over a decade. I'm curious, how are clinicians viewing this space? Are you talking to people who are excited about talking to you about this, about wanting to see this move forward, about wanting to get these trials done? Or is there more cynicism, or at least some exhaustion that we've heard about the space before? You need to convince them that it's going to be a benefit. How does the therapeutic or the clinical community view things?
My feeling is that cynicism has gone or is going. Definitely, earlier on in the lifespan of renal denervation, there was some cynicism, some criticism. But now I really think that the tide is changing. When we were at the TCT conference where the Radiance 2 data was presented, it was a really, really positive feeling from all the different groups of physicians that were there. And to me, it felt like a very different world that we've moved into. And I think because of all the positive data that now is out there supporting URDN, the fact that we've got these 3 trials that are incredibly successful and all statistically significant, people are changing their opinion, and that's clear. I really feel that.
That's great. Andy, same question to you. Do you feel a change of tone from folks?
Yeah, I mean, Helen and I have been through this journey together, and I feel exactly the same way she has. We encountered tremendous skepticism in the 2013, 2014, well, not so much 2014, 2015, 2016. And as our trials, continued with the tremendous rigor that Helen's team had provided, plus the fact that we had a world-class steering committee, Michelle Azizi, Ajay, Laura Mori at the time, Felix Mahfoud, Andrew Sharp. These are luminaries in the field. So people felt more confident when they saw the rigor of our trials and how we conducted them. And they were ready to, frankly, trust the outcomes of them, whatever they were. And then when the outcomes were positive, they went, this works. Then we need another trial. And that worked. And then Radiance 2 was sort of the confirmatory trial. So I think that was very exciting. And so I think the tide has turned. I really do. I think our data had a lot to do with it.
Fantastic. Great. Well, it's a story that's gone on for a long time, but it's one that I'm glad to see is starting to present some positive news and giving folks a reason for hope. So thank you for all the work you've done on this, and thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, Chris Newmarker, that is a wrap. As we said, we're looking forward to hearing from our listeners in some form or fashion next week. Folks can DM us on social media, or they can record their own message through the link that you'll find on Mass Device. And we hope they'll be part of our Stories of the Year episode next week on DeviceTalks Weekly. So if we want people to DM us, how can people find you on social media, Chris?
I mean, really, the place where I'm at is LinkedIn. So, find me on LinkedIn, yep. Chris Newmarker, just like a Newmarker.
And same here. Yes. Find me on LinkedIn, Tom Salemi. Connect with us when you do. Again, tell us what your stories of the year are, and whether you want us to mention your name or not, let us know about that. And also, since you're on LinkedIn, make sure you share episodes of this podcast, which would be great. Folks, we'll be rolling out, I've mentioned this a few times, but we'll be rolling out more podcasts in 2022. So what do we want folks to do with the DeviceTalks Podcast Network, Chris?
Man, they got to follow, subscribe.
Exactly. You follow, and or subscribe to the DeviceTalks Podcast Network. You'll not only receive this flagship podcast, but also Stryker Talks, Intuitive Talks, and more to come. And of course, you should also subscribe to Medtronic Talks. That has its own channel. And we'll have many more of those in 2023 as well.
Smorgasbord of medtech content.
We've been saying that word a lot lately, it seems. I don't know if I've ever been part of a smorgasbord. I mean, that sounds very specific. I've done buffets, obviously, but
should I use that word this time? A buffet? I don't know. Buffet.
I don't know. Smorgasbord is more impactful, I think. We'll stick with it. But now I'm hungry. All right, Chris Newmarker.
You ready to get a big giant pretzel at the smorgasbord?
That's it, folks. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week. And please be part of our MedTech Stories of the Year on next week's DeviceTalks Weekly.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the holiday season.